Okay, now that you have the chance to read chapter one, and if you have not, don't watch the videos. I go back so that when I walk through the video with you, you have read it and we can kind of look together some key parts of here. Okay, so I want us to start with the idea that's on page 4. That's one of the key aspects here of this book, and a big part of the course is trying to look at policy as a grassroots project, at policy on the ground as a kind of a street level bureaucrat idea. Policy as a form of practice that we all can contribute to and can participate in. That teachers are not outside the policy process, just as folks in higher ed are not, just as folks working in cultural environments and NGOs and or institutions, arts institutions. They have the necessity, and more today, their work requires that they have a certain understanding of how policy practice might play a role with them, how they respond to external practices. We're all living under enormous pressure today from, let's say, governments and entities kind of pushing education in certain directions. And educators have always dealt with shifts in their districts and their state and their schools themselves, right? So principal shifts, a change, and all of a sudden there's a new vision, a new direction, and oftentimes teachers are asked and left to do and implement some of these policies that are coming from top down without any kind of sense of agency, any sense of participation, and at times even having never thought about their identity as connected to this sense of governance, this sense of participation and commitment and connection and engagement with what it means to shape the nature and the structure of school communities, of NGO communities, of institutions, higher education as well, right? So the idea is not just that we can talk back to policy coming from down up, from up down, but we can also contribute as a bottom-up process, right? To really be part of policy, see ourselves as policy practitioners, and see ourselves as engaging with this, with the idea of policy as a practice. I think that in many ways, if you look at page 5, the idea here is that policies can be seen as communities working toward efforts to solve problems, right? But and so a significant part of this is thinking about policy as an interactive element, right? Hence a practice, something that we do. So the policy is not just a text. Policy is not just legislation. Policy is not just something that gets preceded by some kind of a prefix, right? Proposition 21 or whatever, right? Bill, whatever. So policy to. So a first premise here for us is that practitioners, educators, teachers, music teachers, folks in higher education and in NGOs are not simply what Lowy has called in a position of permanent receivership, right? They're not just having to digest and deal with policy that comes from elsewhere. That there is actually quite a degenerative element here that places individuals who are essential to the work of schools, teachers, outside the realm of participation, design, development, engagement in governance, right, and in vision development, in communication, and so forth, right? So we see more and more, I think, a tension between the kinds of schools that really see that as critical, and teachers as a big part of this, of an actual community, a community of practice and a community of governance, and then schools that try to do something top down, where teachers are just functionaries. They're just people delivering content, right? And I think that we all need to be thinking, you for sure, those of you who are young in the profession, that are entering the profession, thinking about the distance and the difference between the kind of work that is more immediate, that perhaps are going to be part of your first few months and maybe even first year in schools, that are more connected to your classroom, the content, the pedagogy, the curriculum, right, the day-to-day kind of thing. But the more you spend time in these environments, the more you're going to see, and there's ample evidence to this, that the environment matters, that being part of decision making in that environment matters, that knowing how to communicate in that environment matters, that understanding the contingencies, the context of the environment matters greatly. As you communicate laterally with other teachers, with parents, as you communicate up with administration, or even with the district, right? And as you engage with policy formation within your own classroom, right? The kinds of things that you do, the programs that you develop, the curriculum that you choose, repertoire, the kind of pedagogy, the manner in which you relate to students, how you are focused on something that is student-centered or more teacher-centered, all these things are in some way or another a form of policy practice, right? You structuring that environment in some way, you establishing parameters of action, you putting together rules, you kind of developing a vision, you engaging in forms of leadership, both within the classroom, but then also as you interact upward. And there's ample evidence and research that talks, for instance, about music educators being feeling isolated in their environments. And I think that a critical part of this is that we have never thought about ourselves as a policy agent within school communities, right? And this is this work, right? This is what this book is about, and the course is trying to connect this aspect, this kind of triangular part between know-how, this content-driven, meaning music, and right, the pedagogical content, or how to engage with this, and then the policy content, meaning policy know-how, right? How do we do things pedagogically, pedagogical know-how? How do we do things in terms of content, the content know-how, and how do we do in terms of the interactions with the context, with the community, which is the policy know-how aspect, right? And these things are intended, and they function similarly if you're an NGO, if you're in higher education, if you're in schools, if you're in an arts institution. So just the names of the players change, but the relationship is the same, and these kind of critical elements are significant. So a big part of what we talked about on page 7 and 8 all the way to 10, and if you look at 10, there's an interesting figure there that talks about this structure of policy know-how. And I try to play out and talk about this issue that if there is no vision, there's no program. If there's no framing, there's no program. If there's no communication, there's no program. And if there's no action, there's no program, right? So if we think again from, not just the immediacy of what we're doing in the classroom in my lesson plan, but we start thinking about what does it mean to become an educator and be a part of this environment, or become, an NGO worker and being a part of this environment. These questions of policy, these questions of vision, of communication, of framing, how do I place an idea, right? I can't just say and come to a principle and say, oh, we really need this. Well, because music is important, because it's important for my students, because I need it, right? You have to kind of be able to communicate. You have to be able to think about strategically. You have to find points of connection between what you're wanting and what the school is wanting, what the vision and and the mission of the school is, and what policies are coming up that you might use, right, to leverage the kinds of learnings and the kinds of opportunities, the kinds of program development that you want to see. Right, so these things about how do you think together, how do you connect with a network, how do you engage with other educators participating, and how do we think through then a policy language, right, as I talked about on page 11. This idea of community partnerships or collaborative decision making, about stakeholders, right? These things can have a significant impact, particularly if we think of policy as I articulate in page 13, that policy is a process of building alternatives, right? For instance, later on I have a box there that talks about festivals. Thinking differently about the nature and the idea of festivals is just one example of how policy is a way of thinking about alternatives. If the idea of competition is something that has limits for you, that you find yourself making a critique of it, what is the alternative then to think through, kind of a festival policy? And as you go through the book, you see that I offer several examples they're similar to this, right? So I want to make sure that we're thinking that about the kinds of backwards designs, right? There's no point in a moment of crisis just responding to something. There's no real leverage in simply asking, for, resources, or for space, or for time, or for a kind of a collaborative environment to develop, let's say, a project-based project, if you're not thinking about that in relationship to the other policies that the school environment is living under, right? So how do we make that connection? How do we think ourselves as agents within that environment, right? How do we create a relationship between the policies as texts, right? And bring that into the day-to-day encounter and start thinking about policy not just as a text, but really as engendering the kind of political life of the school, and the kind of making in that, and making an impact, becoming known, becoming an entity, right? So that we can then think about, for instance, in page 16, how do we think about how professionals and leaders engage with that process, the kinds of questions they ask, and that you also should be asking as part of this thinking of yourself as a policy agent, right? So, for instance, in page 16, you can see that I asked about what is most pressing to the people I work with, right? If you want to engage in that process, you also need to understand what is it that people think are significant, right? When you want to collaborate, when you want to engage in coalition, that's a critical part of it. How would the environment, for instance, react if I want to change directions in a program, right? Not just the student environments, the parents, the colleagues, principal, so forth and so on, right? So thinking about change, right? Thinking about the process of engage with something that builds from the context, the needs and interests of students, your own interests, right? As well as then connecting and building with the community. Who will benefit from changes or from action, right? What will be most impactful to the context today? How do I learn and bring these things beyond kind of sense of survival skills, but really develop in a sense of thriving, of developing, right? Of really kind of building a community that is meaningful, right? So on page 18, I ask in the box, given the context of the school that you were working, what priorities will you establish for the music program, and how you go about enacting them? Knowing that schools are very, very different, even in New York, right? The variety and the diversity of schools' missions, the schools' environments, who they hire, how they operate, the level of relationship between the kinds of schools that are much more traditional, where teachers are there just to do things and implement and not participate, to the schools that are very activist oriented. We have some readings by Eric Shea, and I cite Eric's work here in this course. That he worked in a charter school that was built and developed and cultivated by teachers, and all the administration were also teachers, right? He is now working with Out of Bounds, another model of kind of participation and interaction, right? So a key thing of this, as you see it go toward the end, for instance, on page 23, when you see that last design there, is a move away from the idea of policy just as a limitation, right? But start thinking about the arena, the life world in which we live, right, and work, whatever the environment it is. And thinking about that policy as a practice that leads to kind of strategic thinking, to kind of framing elements, to being an influence, to converge, bring people, coalitions and things together, right? And so thinking about this in terms of the kinds of environments that we can do, and to really a sense of citizenship building within the school environment, right? A significant part of teachers continue to leave the profession between years 4 and 5. That kind of 5-year window is really critical, and we lose a lot of teachers within that environment. I'm convinced that a big part of that is because teachers oftentimes have never engaged with this idea of seeing themselves as agents within the school, being part of the governance, thinking and understanding policy as a practice that goes in tandem with the kinds of things they're doing through their context, through their pedagogy and curriculum, and then link those two to the wider context at the school. That's the message here, and that's what we're going to develop throughout this course. So hopefully chapter 1 was a key part of this for you. Okay, take care.